don't realize you niggas ain't dead, Mike. We ain't free, man. I been chasing niggas, dragging niggas, facing niggas, man. No, I ain't. So you ain't spend my shit.
Hold on, that shit going on. Choppa gang shit, Choppa gang shit, man. I ain't gonna lie to y'all. We ain't got a prop to crop out here. We real, we slugging shit. Nigga ain't gonna die.
When federal agents raided Choppa gang's operations, they didn't just find drugs and guns. They uncovered text messages that revealed the true nature of Memphis's most dangerous criminal enterprise. Messages like, if they got a car and ain't using it, that hoe took. Got a gun and don't want to use it, that hoe took. Direct orders from Sophistication himself, commanding his crew of over 50 members to commit acts of violence across the city.
I feel like it's a lot of pressure, but at the same time, like, it's a lot of like anticipation for real, you know?
This ain't your typical street gang, fam. We're talking about a criminal organization so sophisticated that the FBI had to launch a multi-year investigation just to understand how deep their operations went. From federal weapons trafficking to coordinated hits, from robbing rival gangs to accidentally releasing convicted murderers, Choppa gang has left a trail of chaos that stretches from the projects of Memphis to the federal courthouse. But here's what makes them truly terrifying.
I had to come with this particular song because it's like the message, you know? It fit like around a I'm back type of vibe, you know what I'm saying?
Their leader was simultaneously one of hip-hop's biggest rising stars. While Sophistication was collaborating with Lil Durk and getting cosigns from Gucci Mane, he was also orchestrating a criminal empire that the feds say operated like a military unit. One member thought he spotted an enemy and opened fire, but it was just an innocent civilian who's now paralyzed for life. Another member walked out of jail after being convicted of murder because of a paperwork error and is still on the run. Stay locked in until the end, because the federal indictment documents I'm about to break down will show you exactly why law enforcement considers Choppa gang the most dangerous criminal organization to ever emerge from the South.
50 gangs across the city of Memphis. Tonight, we got to look inside the work MPD's multi-gang unit does daily, tracking the crimes these gangs commit.
The text messages, the weapons cache, and the coordinated violence. This is the complete story of how the feds brought down Memphis's most feared gang. Before we dive into the chaos, you need to understand why federal law enforcement became so obsessed with taking down Choppa gang. This wasn't just local police dealing with neighborhood beef. This was a multi-agency federal investigation that treated Choppa gang as a national security threat. The FBI's Memphis field office had been monitoring gang activity in the city for years, but Choppa gang represented something they'd never seen before.
Who know each other or people who are related, but that does not take away the fact that there is still gang-related crimes happening in the city.
Most street gangs operate within limited territories and focus on local drug sales or petty crime. But Choppa gang was different. They were operating across state lines, trafficking federal weapons, and using social media and music to coordinate criminal activities on a scale that demanded federal intervention. What really caught the feds' attention was the sophistication of their operations. These weren't just random acts of violence. They were coordinated attacks planned through encrypted communications, executed with military-grade weapons, and covered up through a network of associates that spanned multiple states.
48 active gangs in Memphis, the Memphis Police Department's multi-gang unit.
When federal agents started intercepting their communications, they realized they were dealing with something closer to organized crime than traditional gang activity. The turning point came when intelligence analysts noticed patterns in the violence. Shootings, robberies, and intimidation tactics were happening in sequence, often coordinated through group messages that federal wiretaps were picking up. The feds realized that Sophistication wasn't just a rapper who happened to be involved in crime. He was actively using his platform and resources to fund and direct a criminal enterprise.
MPD leaders said the subset gangs are what causes some of the violent crimes around the city.
We have the national gangs, but what we have in the cities is what they call subset gangs.
Memphis has always been a violent city, but Choppa gang's activities were pushing the murder rate to unprecedented levels. Federal statistics showed that areas where Choppa gang operated saw a 40% increase in violent crime between 2019 and 2021. The gang wasn't just participating in existing violence. They were creating new cycles of retaliation and fear that were destabilizing entire neighborhoods. What made the federal case even more compelling was the interstate nature of their crimes. Choppa gang members were documented traveling to Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and other states to commit robberies and drug deals. This interstate activity activity automatically triggered federal jurisdiction and allowed agencies like the FBI, DEA, and ATF to pool their resources for a comprehensive investigation.
Violent men and women, according to MPD.
The names come up from time to time. Some of them are more active than others. The team recently did a couple of operations.
The feds also recognized that Choppa Gang represented a new model of criminal organization, one that used social media, music, and celebrity status to recruit members and coordinate activities. Traditional law enforcement tactics weren't sufficient to deal with a gang that could reach thousands of potential recruits through Instagram posts and YouTube videos. The federal investigation into Choppa Gang's origins revealed a transformation that law enforcement officials describe as unprecedented in modern gang history. What started as a neighborhood crew in the Cane Creek apartments became a criminal organization that the FBI would eventually classify as a continuing criminal enterprise, the same designation used for major drug cartels and organized crime families. Lontrell Williams, better known as Pooh Shiesty, didn't just stumble into gang leadership.
Prosecutors say Pooh Shiesty was part of the group that ended up in this parking lot that October afternoon where the shots flew.
Federal documents show he systematically built Choppa Gang into a hierarchical organization with defined roles, territories, and operational procedures. Unlike traditional gangs that evolve organically, Choppa Gang was designed from the beginning to be a criminal business. The Cane Creek apartments on Memphis' south side provided the perfect recruiting ground. Federal housing projects create concentrated poverty, limited opportunities, and social conditions that make young people vulnerable to gang recruitment. But Shiesty's approach was different from typical gang leaders. He offered not just protection and belonging, but a vision of wealth and success that extended beyond the neighborhood.
I really was getting it together as I was in there doing my time, but I couldn't finish it because I'm getting new experiences and I'm going through new things, and so I wrapped it up first day in the studio.
Federal wiretaps revealed that Shiesty studied successful criminal organizations and deliberately modeled Choppa Gang's structure on what he learned. He established clear chains of command, specialized roles for different members, and communication protocols designed to avoid law enforcement detection. This wasn't accidental. It was strategic planning by someone who understood both the streets and the system. His cousin Rodney Wright, known as Big 30, became the organization's primary enforcer and military commander. Federal documents describe Big 30 as responsible for weapons procurement, training new recruits in combat tactics, and planning violent operations. His nickname references his preferred weapon, a .30 caliber rifle.
A lot deeper than just the music stuff that most people might not even realize.
Yeah, it's deeper than that. I've been knowing him before, right? We only been rapping a couple years. I've been knowing him a lot of years.
But federal agents discovered he had access to a much more extensive arsenal. The early recruitment strategy focused on young men who had already demonstrated willingness to use violence but lacked the organization and resources to be truly dangerous. Choppa Gang provided weapons, training, and most importantly, a sense of purpose and identity that many recruits had never experienced. Federal psychologists who studied the organization noted that Shiesty was particularly skilled at identifying and exploiting the psychological vulnerabilities of potential members. What made Choppa Gang's recruitment so effective was the combination of fear and aspiration. Potential members saw the wealth and success that came with gang membership, but they also understood the consequences of refusing to join, or worse, opposing the organization.
Tonight, a family is grieving after a deadly shooting in South Memphis. Dozens of law enforcement, including U.S. Marshals and Memphis police, swarmed South 3rd Street and Mallory Avenue this afternoon.
Federal investigators documented numerous cases of young men who were essentially forced to choose between joining Choppa Gang or becoming their targets. The gang's territorial expansion followed a deliberate pattern that federal analysts compared to military conquest. They would identify rival crews or independent operators in specific neighborhoods, then use overwhelming force to eliminate competition and establish control. This wasn't random violence. It was systematic territorial acquisition designed to maximize criminal opportunities while minimizing law enforcement interference. By 2019, federal surveillance had identified Choppa Gang operations in over a dozen Memphis neighborhoods, with satellite operations in surrounding counties and other states.
We had received information, real-time information on them, and they found them located in a house in the insulation hiding area.
The organization had grown from a small crew of childhood friends to a criminal network with over 50 active members and hundreds of associates. This rapid expansion caught the attention of federal agencies who recognized that traditional local law enforcement was insufficient to address the threat. Federal law enforcement's interest in Choppa gang intensified as their criminal activities became more sophisticated and violent. What started as petty robberies and neighborhood disputes evolved into a criminal enterprise that federal agents describe as unprecedented in its scope and brutality. The transformation began around 2018 when federal wiretaps first picked up communications suggesting that Choppa gang was moving beyond traditional street crime.
MPD leaders also noted in the past 2 months of their fugitive task force, they have arrested over 600 people. 400 had violent warrants.
Instead of random robberies and drug sales, they were planning coordinated operations that required advanced surveillance, multiple participants, and sophisticated escape plans. Federal analysts noted that their communications showed military-style planning and execution. One of the earliest federal red flags was Choppa gang's approach to weapons acquisition. Most street gangs acquire firearms through informal networks, stolen guns, straw purchases, or trades with other criminals. But federal ATF agents discovered that Choppa gang was systematically purchasing weapons through multiple channels, including licensed dealers, gun shows, and interstate trafficking networks.
Recently, the department had Operation All Off Boyd. That was in the area of Tate and Boyd, where much of the gang is located.
The gang's weapons inventory, as documented by federal agents, included assault rifles, high-capacity handguns, and most concerning illegal modifications that converted semi-automatic weapons to full auto capability. These switches are federal crimes that carry mandatory minimum sentences, but Choppa gang members were manufacturing and distributing them throughout the Memphis area. Federal DEA agents also noticed that Choppa gang's drug operations were more sophisticated than typical street-level dealing. Instead of selling small quantities to individual users, they were moving wholesale quantities to other criminal organizations.
Another crisis was brewing, hitting South Memphis hard. Deaths from opioid and other drug addictions have gone up since 2020, and local organizations, along with the Shelby County Drug Court, are working to get people more treatment.
Federal financial investigations revealed that the gang was generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in drug revenue, money that was being reinvested in weapons, vehicles, and operational expansion. But what really caught federal attention was the gang's use of technology and social media to coordinate criminal activities. Federal cybercrime specialists discovered that Choppa gang members were using encrypted messaging apps, burner phones, and coded language to plan operations and avoid law enforcement detection. This level of operational security was typically associated with international criminal organizations, not local street gangs. The federal investigation revealed that Pooh Shiesty was personally involved in planning and directing criminal operations even as his music career was taking off. Wiretapped conversations showed him giving specific orders for robberies, discussing weapons purchases, and coordinating retaliation against rivals. This wasn't a case of a successful artist who had distanced himself from street activities. He was actively managing a criminal enterprise. Federal agents were particularly concerned about Choppa gang's recruitment and training methods. Unlike traditional gangs that rely on informal initiation processes, Choppa gang had developed systematic training programs for new members. Federal surveillance documented training sessions where recruits were taught weapons handling, surveillance techniques, and operational security measures. The gang's financial operations also attracted federal scrutiny. Money laundering investigations revealed that Choppa gang was using legitimate businesses, music industry connections, and complex financial transactions to hide criminal proceeds. Federal financial crime specialists discovered bank accounts, real estate purchases, and business investments that appeared designed to legitimize drug and robbery proceeds. Perhaps most concerning to federal agents was evidence that Choppa gang was beginning to corrupt local institutions. Federal investigations documented attempts to bribe police officers, intimidate witnesses, and influence court proceedings. This type of institutional corruption represented a direct threat to the rule of law that demanded federal intervention. The interstate nature of Choppa Gang's activities became increasingly apparent as federal agents tracked their operations across multiple states. Members were documented committing crimes in Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and other jurisdictions, often coordinating their activities through the same communication networks used for local operations. This interstate activity automatically triggered federal jurisdiction and allowed agencies to pool resources for a comprehensive investigation. The war between Choppa Gang and EBGE Jizzle's Bezel Gang marked a turning point in federal law enforcement's approach to Memphis gang violence. What local police initially viewed as typical street beef, federal agents recognized as a coordinated campaign of violence that threatened public safety on an unprecedented scale. Federal wiretaps captured the planning and execution of the robbery that sparked the conflict. Unlike spontaneous street crime, the attack on EBG's operation showed military-style coordination that federal agents compared to organized crime hits. Choppa Gang members conducted advanced surveillance, planned multiple escape routes, and coordinated their attack through encrypted communications that federal cybercrime specialists were monitoring. The robbery itself was particularly brazen. Choppa Gang didn't just steal money and drugs, they deliberately humiliated their victims in ways designed to provoke retaliation. Federal behavioral analysts noted that this wasn't typical criminal behavior focused on profit, but psychological warfare designed to establish dominance and trigger a violent response that would justify further escalation. When Pushisti turned the robbery into the hit song Back in Blood with Lil Durk, federal agents realized they were dealing with something entirely new, a criminal organization that was using mainstream media to taunt rivals and recruit new members. The song's success brought national attention to Memphis gang culture, but it also provided federal investigators with detailed evidence of criminal activities. Federal communications intercepts revealed that the song's release was coordinated with planned retaliation against EBG. Choppa Gang members were documented discussing how the song would disrespect their rivals and force them to respond with violence. This showed federal agents that the gang was deliberately escalating conflicts to maintain their reputation and expand their territory. EBGE Jizzle's response, recording his own version of Back in Blood, was monitored by federal agents who recognized it as more than just a diss track. The song contained specific details about Choppa Gang's operations, territories, and members that federal investigators used to corroborate their own intelligence. In effect, the rap beef was providing federal agents with real-time intelligence about gang activities. The shooting of EBGE Jizzle represented a significant escalation that brought federal attention to the conflict. Federal ballistics experts analyzed the weapons used and determined that they were part of the same arsenal that Choppa Gang had been accumulating through their weapons trafficking operations. The shooting wasn't random street violence. It was a coordinated hit using federal-level firepower. Federal surveillance teams documented Choppa Gang's celebration of the shooting through social media posts and intercepted communications. Members were recorded discussing the attack in detail, providing federal prosecutors with evidence of conspiracy and coordination. The gang's willingness to openly celebrate violence showed federal agents that they felt immune from law enforcement consequences. The conflict's impact on Memphis's murder rate caught federal attention when statistical analysis showed that areas where Choppa Gang and EBG operated saw a 60% increase in violent crime during the peak of their war. Federal crime analysts determined that the gang conflict was creating secondary violence as other criminal organizations chose sides or tried to exploit the chaos. Federal agents were particularly concerned about the weapons being used in the conflict. Ballistics analysis revealed that both sides had access to assault rifles, high-capacity magazines, and illegal modifications that federal agents typically associated with international arms trafficking. The level of firepower being deployed in Memphis neighborhoods was unprecedented in the city's history. The federal investigation revealed that the EBG conflict was being used by Choppa Gang as a recruitment tool. Federal surveillance documented gang members using the war to attract new recruits who wanted to be part of a winning organization. The violence wasn't just about territory or revenge. It was a marketing strategy designed to build the gang's reputation and expand their membership. Federal financial investigations showed that the conflict was also profitable for Choppa Gang. As they eliminated competition and established control over EBG's former territories, they gained access to new drug markets and criminal opportunities. Federal analysts estimated that the gang's revenue increased by over 200% during the peak of the conflict. Federal law enforcement's analysis of Choppa Gang revealed a disturbing pattern of what they termed crash dummy culture. the systematic encouragement of reckless violence by gang members willing to sacrifice their lives and freedom for the organization. The case of Lil Hank became a federal case study in how gang leadership manipulates vulnerable young men into committing senseless acts of violence. Federal behavioral analysts who studied Lil Hank's case noted that his actions weren't the result of spontaneous anger or mistaken identity. They were the predictable outcome of a gang culture that rewarded extreme violence and punished any sign of weakness or hesitation. Federal wiretaps revealed that Choppa gang leadership deliberately cultivated this mindset among their members. The shooting that left an innocent civilian paralyzed was captured on federal surveillance equipment that had been monitoring Choppa gang activities. Federal agents watched in real time as Lil Hank opened fire on what he thought was an enemy vehicle, demonstrating the kind of reckless disregard for public safety that made the gang a federal priority. Federal crime scene analysis revealed that Lil Hank had fired over 20 rounds from a high-powered rifle in a residential neighborhood during daylight hours. The ballistics report showed that bullets struck multiple buildings, vehicles, and nearly hit several other civilians who happened to be in the area. Federal agents realized that this wasn't just gang violence. It was domestic terrorism that threatened the entire community. The federal investigation into Lil Hank's background revealed how Choppa gang's recruitment and indoctrination process created crash dummies willing to throw their lives away for the organization. Federal psychologists noted that Hank had been systematically isolated from positive influences and surrounded by gang members who reinforced the idea that extreme violence was not just acceptable, but necessary for respect and survival. Federal communications intercepts revealed that Pooh Shiesty and other gang leaders continued to glorify Lil Hank even after his arrest, using his case as an example of loyalty and dedication that other members should emulate. Federal agents realized that the gang was using Hank's imprisonment as a recruitment tool, telling potential members that this was the kind of sacrifice expected from true gang members. The federal analysis of Choppa gang's crash dummy culture revealed a systematic pattern of manipulation and exploitation. Young men were recruited with promises of money, respect, and protection, but were ultimately used as expendable soldiers in the gang's criminal operations. Federal investigators documented dozens of cases where gang members had been encouraged to take extreme risks that resulted in death or lengthy prison sentences. Federal surveillance revealed that Choppa gang leadership had developed specific strategies for identifying and recruiting potential crash dummies. They targeted young men with histories of trauma, limited family support, and few legitimate opportunities for success. Federal social workers noted that the gang was essentially preying on the most vulnerable members of the community. The federal investigation showed that Lil Hank's case wasn't isolated. It was part of a pattern of reckless violence that federal agents attributed directly to Choppa gang's leadership and culture. Federal crime analysts identified over a dozen similar incidents where gang members had committed senseless acts of violence that endangered innocent civilians. Federal prosecutors used Lil Hank's case as evidence of Choppa gang's continuing criminal enterprise status, arguing that the gang's systematic encouragement of reckless violence represented a threat to public safety that required federal intervention. The case became a cornerstone of the federal government's argument that Choppa gang wasn't just a local gang, but a criminal organization that threatened national security. Federal victim services specialists worked with the civilian who was paralyzed in Lil Hank's attack, documenting the long-term impact of gang violence on innocent community members. The victim's story became a powerful tool for federal prosecutors seeking to demonstrate the human cost of Choppa gang's activities and justify the resources being devoted to the investigation. The case of White Grape provided federal investigators with unique insights into Choppa gang's recruitment strategies and the psychological manipulation used to control gang members. Federal behavioral analysts studied his case as an example of how the gang exploited racial dynamics and personal insecurities to create loyal soldiers willing to commit murder.
I did it when I came home and everything just hit me and it came out perfect. My producer, TP.
Federal surveillance had been monitoring White Grape's activities as part of their broader investigation into Choppa gang's operations. Federal agents documented his recruitment process, noting how gang leaders used his racial identity as both a tool for manipulation and a source of constant pressure to prove his loyalty through increasingly extreme acts. The federal investigation revealed that White Grape's acceptance into Choppa gang wasn't accidental. It was a calculated decision by gang leadership to demonstrate their power and attract attention from other potential recruits. Federal analysts noted that having a white member in a predominantly black gang served multiple strategic purposes for the organization.
Like, they been counting on me. They already knew, like, when people doubted, they knew, like.
Federal wiretaps captured conversations where gang members discussed White Grape's status within the organization, revealing the constant pressure he faced to prove himself worthy of membership. Federal psychologists noted that this pressure created a psychological dynamic that made him particularly vulnerable to manipulation and likely to commit extreme acts of violence. The robbery that led to White Grape's downfall was monitored by federal surveillance teams who had been tracking his activities as part of their broader investigation. Federal agents watched as he attempted to make a drug purchase, was robbed and beaten, and then faced immediate expulsion from the gang for his perceived weakness. Federal behavioral analysts noted that Pushiesti's decision to kick White Grape out of the gang wasn't based on the robbery itself, but on the gang's need to maintain an image of invincibility and strength. Federal investigators realized that the gang's reputation was so important to its operations that any sign of weakness, even from a single member, threatened the entire organization's credibility. The federal investigation revealed that White Grape's decision to commit murder wasn't spontaneous revenge. It was a calculated attempt to regain his status within an organization that had become central to his identity. Federal psychologists noted that the gang had successfully isolated him from other sources of self-worth and belonging, making membership in Choppa gang essential to his psychological survival. Federal surveillance teams documented White Grape's planning and execution of the murder, noting the methodical way he tracked down his victim and carried out the killing. Federal agents realized that his actions demonstrated the kind of training and indoctrination that Choppa gang provided to its members, turning ordinary young men into efficient killers.
This little dude, for real, like, he who he is, so I'ma produce every time.
The federal analysis of White Grape's case revealed how Choppa gang used racial dynamics to maintain control over its members. Federal investigators noted that the gang deliberately created situations where members felt they had to prove their loyalty through extreme acts, knowing that this pressure would result in violence that served the organization's interests. Federal prosecutors used White Grape's case as evidence of Choppa gang's systematic manipulation and exploitation of vulnerable individuals. The case demonstrated how the gang recruited members specifically to use them as expendable soldiers in their criminal operations, with no regard for the human cost of their actions. The federal investigation showed that White Grape's murder case wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of violence that federal agents attributed directly to Choppa gang's recruitment and indoctrination strategies. Federal crime analysts identified multiple cases where gang members had committed murders or other serious crimes in attempts to prove their loyalty to the organization. Federal victim services specialists worked with the family of White Grape's murder victim, documenting how gang violence destroys not just the lives of gang members, but innocent community members who become targets of their desperate attempts to maintain status within criminal organizations. The case of Anthony Choppa Wop Green represents one of the most embarrassing failures in federal law enforcement history and demonstrates the ongoing threat posed by Choppa gang members even after their supposed capture. Federal agencies are currently conducting an intensive manhunt for a convicted murderer whose accidental release has become a national security concern.
Been with me from the start. His first song, my first song was his first beat. So, you know, it's the chemistry. I said, I ain't fumble shit, the whole world been waiting on this. I can't fumble shit, the whole world been waiting on it. You got disbelievers and you got strong believers, you know.
Federal investigators had been tracking Choppa Wop's activities for years as part of their broader investigation into Choppa gang's criminal enterprise. Federal surveillance teams documented his involvement in multiple violent crimes, including the 2020 murder of Octavius Atkins that would eventually lead to his conviction. The federal analysis of Choppa Wop's murder case revealed the systematic nature of Choppa gang's violent operations. Federal ballistics experts determined that the weapon used in the killing was part of the gang's shared arsenal, and federal communications intercepts showed that the murder was discussed and planned through the same networks used for other gang activities. Federal prosecutors worked closely with local authorities to ensure Choppa Wop's conviction, viewing his case as a crucial component of their broader strategy to dismantle Choppa gang's leadership structure. Federal agents testified at his trial, providing evidence gathered through years of surveillance and investigation. The accidental release of a convicted murderer created a federal crisis that required immediate response from multiple agencies. Federal marshals, FBI agents, and other law enforcement personnel were deployed to Memphis within hours of discovering the mistake, launching one of the largest manhunts in the city's history. Federal analysis of the jail's computer systems revealed how the clerical error occurred, but also exposed broader security vulnerabilities that federal authorities worry could be exploited by other criminal organizations. The incident prompted a federal review of jail procedures and communication protocols throughout the region. Federal behavioral analysts studying Choppa Wap's case noted that his escape represents more than just a fugitive situation. It's a test of the federal government's ability to maintain control over dangerous criminals. His continued freedom undermines public confidence in the justice system and potentially encourages other gang members to believe they can evade federal prosecution. The federal manhunt for Choppa Wap has involved resources typically reserved for international terrorists or major organized crime figures. Federal agents have deployed advanced surveillance technology, coordinated with international law enforcement agencies, and offered substantial rewards for information leading to his capture.
I came from it. I came from a couple dudes like that was like, help me with my...
Federal intelligence analysts believe that Choppa Wap's escape was facilitated by remaining Choppa gang members and associates who helped him disappear immediately after his release. Federal wiretaps and surveillance operations are ongoing as agents attempt to track down the network that may be hiding him. The federal investigation has revealed that Choppa Wap's escape has become a rallying point for remaining Choppa gang members and other criminal organizations who view his freedom as evidence that the federal government can be defeated. Federal agents worry that his continued freedom could inspire other gang members to take greater risks and commit more serious crimes. Federal prosecutors are treating Choppa Wap's case as a matter of national importance, arguing that his capture is essential to maintaining the credibility of federal law enforcement and the justice system. The resources being devoted to his manhunt reflect the federal government's determination to prove that no criminal, regardless of circumstances, can escape federal justice. Federal Victim Services specialists continue to work with the family of Octavius Atkins, who have been traumatized by the knowledge that their loved one's killer is free and potentially dangerous. The federal government has provided security and support services while the manhunt continues. Federal law enforcement's investigation into Pooh Shiesty revealed a criminal mastermind who was simultaneously building a legitimate music career and expanding a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Federal agents describe his case as unprecedented, a gang leader who used mainstream success to fund and coordinate criminal activities on a national scale. Federal financial investigators tracked every dollar of Pooh Shiesty's music industry earnings, discovering that significant portions of his legitimate income were being funneled directly into Choppa Gang's criminal operations. Federal money laundering specialists documented purchases of weapons, vehicles, and equipment that were clearly intended for criminal use rather than personal consumption. The federal investigation revealed that Shiesty's signing to Gucci Mane's 1017 Records wasn't just a career milestone. It was a strategic move that provided him with resources, connections, and credibility that enhanced his criminal operations. Federal agents noted that his music industry success made him more dangerous, not less, because it provided cover for his criminal activities. Federal surveillance teams documented Shiesty's continued personal involvement in robberies and violent crimes even after achieving mainstream success. Federal agents were shocked to discover that a rapper earning millions of dollars was still personally participating in street-level crimes, suggesting that his criminal activities weren't motivated by financial need, but by psychological compulsion. The federal wiretaps of Shiesty's communications revealed a sophisticated criminal mind that was constantly planning and coordinating illegal activities. Federal analysts noted that his conversations showed strategic thinking typically associated with organized crime bosses rather than street gang leaders. He was thinking several moves ahead and planning for long-term criminal success.
Nashville Metro Police identified the two men as Cayman Carwell and Marvin Roper, both of Memphis.
Federal agents were particularly concerned about Shiesty's use of his music platform to recruit new gang members and coordinate criminal activities. Federal cybercrime specialists discovered that his social media accounts and music videos contained coded messages that were used to communicate with gang members and plan operations. The federal investigation showed that Shiesty's introduction of switches, illegal devices that convert semi-automatic weapons to full auto, represented a significant escalation in Choppa Gang's capabilities. Federal ATF agents noted that these modifications are typically associated with international arms trafficking and represent a serious threat to public safety. Federal surveillance revealed that Shiesty was using his music industry connections to expand Choppa Gang's operations into new territories and markets. Federal agents documented meetings with other artists and industry figures that appeared to be focused on criminal rather than musical collaboration. The federal analysis of Shiesti's text messages and communications revealed the true scope of his criminal leadership. Federal prosecutors noted that his messages showed him giving direct orders for violent crimes, coordinating drug trafficking operations, and planning retaliation against rivals. This wasn't passive involvement. He was actively managing a criminal enterprise. Federal agents were particularly disturbed by evidence that Shiesti was using his wealth and success to corrupt legitimate institutions. Federal investigations documented attempts to bribe law enforcement officials, intimidate witnesses, and influence court proceedings through his music industry connections and financial resources. The federal case against Shiesti became a priority for multiple agencies because his success was inspiring other gang leaders to pursue similar strategies. Federal intelligence analysts worried that his model of combining legitimate success with criminal enterprise could be replicated by other criminal organizations across the country. Federal prosecutors viewed Shiesti's case as essential to sending a message that success in legitimate industries doesn't provide immunity from criminal prosecution. The resources devoted to his investigation and prosecution reflected the federal government's determination to prove that no one, regardless of fame or wealth, is above the law. The Bay Harbor Islands robbery that ultimately brought down Pooh Shiesti provided federal investigators with the concrete evidence they needed to prosecute him under federal firearms and robbery statutes. Federal agents described the incident as a gift that allowed them to move forward with charges they had been building for years. Federal surveillance teams had been monitoring Shiesti's activities in Florida as part of their broader investigation into Choppa Gang's interstate operations. Federal agents were already aware of his presence in the Miami area when the robbery occurred, and they were able to respond immediately to gather evidence.
It's like way more turned, like I ain't really trying to bring nothing back, but
the federal crime scene analysis of the Bay Harbor Islands incident revealed the sophisticated planning and execution that characterized Choppa Gang's operations. Federal agents noted that the robbery wasn't a spontaneous crime of opportunity, but a carefully planned operation that involved advanced surveillance, coordinated timing, and predetermined escape routes. Federal ballistics experts analyzed the weapons used in the robbery, determining that they were part of the same arsenal that federal agents had been tracking through Choppa Gang's weapons trafficking operations. The firearms evidence provided a direct link between the robbery and the broader criminal enterprise that federal prosecutors were building their case around. Federal digital forensics specialists recovered communications and social media evidence that showed Shiesti and his associates planning the robbery in advance. Federal cybercrime experts noted that the gang's use of encrypted messaging and coded language demonstrated operational security awareness typically associated with sophisticated criminal organizations. The federal investigation revealed that the Bay Harbor Islands robbery was part of a pattern of interstate criminal activity that federal agents had been documenting for months. Federal crime analysts identified similar robberies in Georgia, Alabama, and other states that showed the same planning and execution characteristics as the Florida incident. Federal victim services specialists worked with the two men who were robbed and shot during the incident, documenting their injuries and the long-term impact of the crime. Federal prosecutors used their testimony to demonstrate the human cost of Choppa Gang's activities and justify the severe sentences they were seeking. The federal analysis of surveillance footage from the Bay Harbor Islands incident provided prosecutors with clear visual evidence of Shiesti's involvement in the robbery. Federal video analysts enhanced and analyzed the footage to create a timeline of events that clearly showed the planning and execution of the crime. Federal financial investigators tracked the proceeds from the Bay Harbor Islands robbery, discovering that the stolen money and merchandise were quickly distributed through Choppa Gang's network and used to fund additional criminal activities. The financial evidence provided federal prosecutors with additional charges related to money laundering and criminal enterprise. The federal investigation revealed that the Bay Harbor Islands incident wasn't an isolated crime, but part of a systematic pattern of robberies that Choppa Gang was conducting across multiple states. Federal crime analysts identified over a dozen similar incidents that showed the same planning, execution, and distribution patterns.
You know, like every time I feel like somebody, like, you know, or I'm going through somewhere, I feel like.
Federal prosecutors used the Bay Harbor Islands case as the foundation for broader charges related to Choppa Gang's criminal enterprise. The incident provided concrete evidence of interstate criminal activity that allowed federal agencies to justify the resources they had devoted to the investigation and prosecution. The federal indictment against Choppa gang represents one of the most comprehensive criminal enterprise prosecutions in Memphis history. Federal prosecutors spent over 3 years building a case that would expose the full scope of the gang's operations and ensure that its leadership faced appropriate federal penalties. Federal grand jury proceedings revealed evidence that shocked even experienced prosecutors and federal agents. The scope of Choppa gang's criminal activities extended far beyond what local law enforcement had documented, involving interstate drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, money laundering, and coordinated violence that federal prosecutors compared to organized crime operations. The federal wiretap evidence presented to the grand jury included thousands of hours of recorded conversations that revealed the inner workings of Choppa gang's criminal enterprise. Federal prosecutors noted that the recordings showed a level of organization and strategic planning that was unprecedented in their experience with street gangs. Federal prosecutors highlighted specific text messages and communications that showed Pooh Shiesti's direct involvement in planning and coordinating criminal activities. The message stating, "If they got a car and ain't using it, dat hoe took. Got a gun and don't want to use it, dat hoe took," became a centerpiece of the federal case, demonstrating Shiesti's role as the leader of a violent criminal organization. The federal indictment revealed the sophisticated financial operations that Choppa gang had developed to launder criminal proceeds and fund their operations. Federal financial crime specialists documented complex networks of bank accounts, business entities, and real estate transactions that were designed to hide the gang's criminal income. Federal weapons trafficking charges in the indictment revealed that Choppa gang was operating as a major supplier of illegal firearms throughout the southeastern United States. Federal ATF agents documented sales of assault rifles, handguns, and illegal modifications to criminal organizations in multiple states. The federal drug trafficking charges revealed that Choppa gang was moving wholesale quantities of narcotics through networks that extended from Memphis to major cities throughout the region. Federal DEA agents estimated that the gang was generating millions of dollars in drug revenue annually. Federal conspiracy charges in the indictment demonstrated that Choppa gang operated as a continuing criminal enterprise with defined leadership, territories, and operational procedures. Federal prosecutors argued that the gang met all the legal requirements for prosecution under federal organized crime statutes. The federal indictment included charges related to witness intimidation and obstruction of justice, revealing that Choppa gang had systematically attempted to interfere with law enforcement investigations. Federal prosecutors documented threats against witnesses, attempts to bribe officials, and efforts to destroy evidence. Federal prosecutors noted that the indictment represented only a portion of the criminal activities that federal agents had documented during their investigation. The charges were selected to ensure successful prosecution while sending a clear message about the consequences of operating a criminal enterprise. The federal indictment's impact extended beyond Choppa gang to other criminal organizations throughout the region. Federal intelligence analysts noted that the comprehensive nature of the charges and the resources devoted to the investigation sent a clear message that federal law enforcement was prepared to treat street gangs as serious threats to national security. Federal victim services specialists worked with dozens of victims whose cases were included in the indictment, providing support and protection during the prosecution process. The federal government's commitment to victim services reflected the comprehensive approach being taken to address the impact of Choppa gang's criminal activities. Federal prosecutors developed a comprehensive strategy designed not just to convict individual Choppa gang members, but to completely dismantle the criminal organization and prevent its reconstitution. The prosecution approach reflected lessons learned from decades of federal experience with organized crime and gang prosecutions. The federal prosecution team included specialists in organized crime, gang violence, financial crimes, and weapons trafficking, reflecting the complex nature of the charges against Choppa gang. Federal prosecutors noted that the case required expertise typically reserved for major organized crime prosecutions. Federal prosecutors' decision to charge Pooh Shiesti and other gang leaders under federal organized crime statutes was based on extensive analysis of the gang's structure and operations. Federal legal experts noted that Choppa gang met all the criteria for prosecution as a continuing criminal enterprise, including ongoing criminal activity, defined leadership, and systematic operations. The federal plea bargaining strategy was designed to encourage cooperation from lower-level gang members while ensuring that leadership faced appropriate penalties. Federal prosecutors offered reduced sentences to gang members who provided information about the organization's operations and leadership. Federal prosecutors' use of wiretap evidence required extensive legal preparation to ensure that the recordings would be admissible in court. Federal legal experts noted that the quality and quantity of the wiretap evidence made Choppa Gang one of the strongest organized crime cases they had seen. The federal sentencing strategy was designed to ensure that gang leaders received penalties that would prevent them from resuming criminal activities upon release. Federal prosecutors sought sentences that would keep key gang members in federal prison for decades, effectively ending their criminal careers. Federal prosecutors coordinated with state and local authorities to ensure that gang members who weren't included in federal charges still faced appropriate prosecution. The comprehensive approach was designed to prevent any gang members from escaping consequences for their criminal activities. The federal prosecution's focus on financial crimes was designed to strip Choppa Gang of the resources needed to continue operations. Federal prosecutors sought forfeiture of all assets connected to the gang's criminal activities, including real estate, vehicles, and financial accounts. Federal prosecutors' emphasis on victim impact was designed to demonstrate the human cost of Choppa Gang's activities and justify the severe sentences being sought. Federal victim services specialists worked to ensure that victims' voices were heard throughout the prosecution process. The federal prosecution strategy included extensive media and community outreach designed to educate the public about the dangers of gang involvement and the consequences of criminal activity. Federal prosecutors viewed the case as an opportunity to send a broader message about law enforcement's commitment to public safety. The federal prosecution of Choppa Gang has had far-reaching impacts on Memphis's criminal landscape, but federal law enforcement officials warn that the threat posed by the gang's remaining members and imitators continues to evolve. Federal agencies maintain active investigations into gang activities throughout the region. Federal crime statistics show a significant reduction in violent crime in areas where Choppa Gang previously operated, demonstrating the effectiveness of the federal prosecution strategy. Federal analysts note that the removal of key gang leaders has disrupted criminal networks throughout Memphis and surrounding areas. The federal investigation's impact on other criminal organizations has been substantial, with federal agents noting increased cooperation from informants and witnesses who previously feared retaliation from gang members. The successful prosecution has demonstrated that federal law enforcement can protect those who cooperate with investigations. Federal intelligence analysts continue to monitor communications and activities of remaining Choppa Gang associates, noting attempts to reconstitute the organization under new leadership. Federal agents warn that the gang's criminal infrastructure remains partially intact and could be reactivated by ambitious criminals. The federal prosecution's impact on Memphis's music scene has been complex, with some artists distancing themselves from gang associations while others continue to glorify criminal activity. Federal agents continue to monitor music industry connections that may be facilitating criminal activities. Federal financial investigations continue to track assets and money laundering networks that were established during Choppa Gang's operation. Federal prosecutors note that dismantling the gang's financial infrastructure is essential to preventing its reconstitution. The federal case has become a model for gang prosecutions throughout the country, with federal prosecutors from other districts studying the investigation and prosecution strategies used against Choppa Gang. Federal training programs now include case studies based on the Choppa Gang investigation. Federal victim services programs continue to provide support for individuals and communities affected by Choppa Gang's activities. Federal officials note that the long-term impact of gang violence extends far beyond the immediate victims and requires ongoing intervention and support. Federal law enforcement agencies have increased their presence and activities in Memphis following the Choppa Gang prosecution, recognizing that the city's criminal landscape remains volatile and dangerous. Federal agents continue to work with local authorities to prevent the emergence of new criminal organizations. The federal government's investment in the Choppa Gang prosecution reflects a broader strategy of treating gang violence as a national security issue that requires federal resources and expertise. Federal officials note that the success of the prosecution justifies continued federal involvement in local gang investigations. The federal prosecution of Choppa Gang represents a watershed moment in law enforcement's approach to gang violence, demonstrating that sophisticated criminal organizations can be dismantled through coordinated federal investigation and prosecution. The case has become a model for federal agencies dealing with similar threats throughout the country. Federal law enforcement officials note that the Choppa Gang case proved that traditional distinctions between street gangs and organized crime are no longer relevant. Modern criminal organizations use technology, legitimate businesses, and celebrity status to enhance their operations in ways that require federal resources and expertise to address effectively. The federal investment in the Choppa gang prosecution, estimated at over $10 million in investigation and prosecution costs, reflects the government's recognition that gang violence represents a serious threat to national security and public safety. Federal officials argue that the long-term benefits of dismantling such organizations justify the substantial resources required. Federal prosecutors note that the Choppa gang case has changed how they approach gang investigations, emphasizing the importance of financial crimes, technology, and interstate coordination in building successful cases. The prosecution strategies developed for this case are now being used against criminal organizations throughout the country. The federal government's success in prosecuting Choppa gang has sent a clear message to other criminal organizations that federal law enforcement has the resources and determination to dismantle even the most sophisticated gang operations. Federal agents report increased cooperation from informants and witnesses who previously feared gang retaliation. For the communities affected by Choppa gang's activities, the federal prosecution represents both justice and hope for the future. Federal victim services specialists note that the successful prosecution has helped restore faith in the justice system and encourage community cooperation with law enforcement. The story of Choppa gang serves as a cautionary tale about the ultimate futility of criminal enterprise, regardless of its sophistication or success. Federal prosecutors note that no criminal organization, no matter how well organized or well funded, can ultimately escape federal justice. As federal agents continue to monitor Memphis's criminal landscape, they remain vigilant for signs that new organizations may be attempting to fill the void left by Choppa gang's dismantling. The federal commitment to preventing the emergence of similar threats remains strong, ensuring that the lessons learned from this case will continue to protect communities throughout the region. What do y'all think about how the feds took down this whole operation? The fact that they had wiretaps, surveillance, and were building this case for years, while Pooh Shiesty was getting famous, shows just how deep federal law enforcement goes when they want somebody. Drop your thoughts in the comments about whether you think they'll ever catch Choppa Wop, and make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into how the feds operate when they're hunting the most dangerous gangs in America. Until next time, remember, the streets might be watching, but the feds are always listening.